This morning we're going to cover the type operator in Mongo. One of the things to note about Mongo is that we can store in keys different types. So think about if you're an object-oriented programmer, let's say you do C#, think about list, right? With a list, I can store in a list, let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's say I have 3 values in a list. The second value in a list can sometimes be an int, and it can sometimes be a string, and it can be basically whatever I want it to be, right? This is not an impossible thing unless you're going to try to force a rule. The idea is we can store whatever we want in a list. So in MongoDB, when we go over this, it's going to make more sense if you think of it that way. Again, if you're an object-oriented programmer, that would make a lot more sense than trying to think of it in the SQL way. And the reason why is we'll see. Let's look at just the rules right now, what it would appear in SQL, and I'll give you an example in a second. So if we look at number, the key number appears to always be a number, right? And if we type it to get more values, we'll see that in this value right here, in this document, in this document we don't even have number. But in these documents, number again is still a number, and in these last two though, number is now a string. It's no longer a number. Now, to appreciate this, or to understand this and why this is significant, if you are familiar with SQL Server, what I would suggest is create a table, and create a table with one column, and call that column, let's say column 1, and specify it to be an int. And then insert a string, like the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dogs, into column 1, and see what happens. You'll get a very interesting error. So in this case though, number is a number most of the time, but in 2 values, as we see, number is actually a string. And I'll just give you a practical example, and 2 practical examples. One is that American stocks are generally alphanumeric values. However, in Hong Kong, stocks are numbers. So they start with 0, 8, 7, 8. If that's an actual stock, don't go look it up. I don't know. I was thinking I was making something up, but actually I could throw out something that's real, like 99999. That may actually be a stock too. So you might be able to store, you could store both, and then we could do this type filter, and we could get one or the other if we had, let's say, US stocks and Hong Kong stocks. So let's go ahead and show how type works. So we're going to specify in our find clause here, we're going to look at where the number, that's where we're going to call, and then we're going to say the type, and how the type operator works is $type is 2. That means string. And then we're going to close out things. So what we're going to look at is, in the collection SQL Server, we want to find the documents where the type is a string. Not where it's a number, but where it's a string. Okay? And you'll see we get the NA this time and no period, right? So we get the 2 documents that are strings. Even though, as we've said, that is generally an int column. And like I said, if you don't appreciate that, or you don't see, well, what's the big deal? If you've used SQL Server at all, create a column that has an int, and then try to pass in a string. And to my knowledge, though well, that wouldn't work in SQLite, to my knowledge, other SQL databases are familiar with that. So this is one of those differences, similar to exist. This is one of those differences between NoSQL and SQL. Now, one thing to note too as well, another practical example of this where this is really helpful. Suppose you have a massive data set, like 1 billion rows of data, and you're trying to import this for ETL processes. And in one of the values, it goes back and forth between numbers and strings. As a case in point, out of 100 billion rows, let's just say hypothetically, you have 1,000 exceptions. They're not numbers, they're strings. Okay, so generally speaking, the way that that's handled in the world of ETL and SQL is you will either log it or you'll report it as bad data. And that may be a valid approach, and depending on the data set, again, it all varies on the data set. In the world of NoSQL, you can, as you see, easily query what those string values are. And it would actually be really fast. I am a huge fan of using varchars as SQL, There are times when that's not the best tool, especially if you need to do, let's say, some numeric calculations and you're trying to store both. What's awesome is how easily it is to do, or how easy it is to do numeric calculations. Remember, once I filter the type, and let's say I'm only specifying the numbers, I can first of all keep all of the data. I can then specify the type to be a number, right? And then I can throw my calculation out there, and I still haven't eliminated the string values. So since those are exceptional values, if I want to show clients and I want to say, okay, well, remember, not all of the values are numbers. And some people might believe that they're bad data. Well, we wanted to at least give you the option to see what those exceptions are. Just one of those interesting differences, again, between SQL and NoSQL.